Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it about 30 seconds to a minute as we wait for numbers to go up a bit. For those of you just joining, we're just going to give it another minute while we wait for more people to join the session. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third J-School session. For those of you joining across time zones, thank you for joining. My name is Abby Kirschbaum. I am the Assistant Director of Public Engagement and Educational Resources at J Street. For those of you who are joining this J-School session for the first time, we launched J-School 3 weeks ago as an educational series designed for those looking to develop their knowledge on the conflict and to deepen their understanding of its complexities. Our last two previous weeks, we discussed Zionism and Palestinian narratives through a more personal and collective lens. And now we are shifting gears slightly and taking a more facts on the ground approach. So we are going to be using the next hour as an opportunity to unpack Israel's military occupation of the West Bank with leading expert and former special envoy Frank Lowenstein. Frank Lowenstein served as special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and senior advisor to Secretary Kerry at the US State Department from July 2014 to January 2017. He was directly involved in all aspects of the Obama administration's efforts, including negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians in 2013 and 2014. He received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award, the highest honor awarded by the department. Prior to joining the State Department, Mr. Lowenstein served as staff director and chief counsel for the State Foreign Relations Committee, SFRC, from 2009 until 2011. Mr. Lowenstein is currently an executive director at APCO Worldwide and the international head of the firm's Global Solutions Practice Group. So before I let Frank take it away, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. So for all of those just tuning in, our structure of the session will be as follows. So Frank is going to take us through a presentation for the next 25 to 30 minutes, more or less along the lines of the origins of the occupation, the more day-to-day aspects of its existence, and the policies and the role in which US foreign policy plays. We will then have a nice bit of time devoted to Q&A, and something that is really important that we encourage all of our participants in these J-School sessions to do is to ask as many questions as possible. You'll see that you have a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we really do encourage you to ask any sort of clarifying questions that you might need. We recognize that the subject matter is complex and very new for many of us joining. So we encourage all sorts of questions. And we will again have the last 20 to 25 minutes to go through Q&A. What other items of importance should we discuss? So something to mention is that we're going to be having a discussion portion after the end of the session. So for 30 minutes after the session, there's a follow-up Zoom link, which should be posted in the chat. And you can join, and we'll also include some discussion questions that should guide you through this next hour for you to think about in our follow-up session. So if you have any questions, feel free to list them in the chat again. And without further ado, Frank Lowenstein, thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much, Abby. So I just wanted to give you guys a very quick little bit of context on how this presentation came about. It really started in 2015 after Netanyahu won the Israeli election and sort of declared that the Palestinians were not going to get a state under his watch. And that really struck a chord with, obviously, with President Obama, with Secretary Kerry, with all of us that worked on this issue. We had a real quandary. Well, what are we supposed to do now? We've put a lot of time and energy into trying to get the negotiations back up and running. Obviously, that process failed. And so where do we go from here? And the president convened everybody in the Situation Room around beginning of April 2015, and to talk about how we were going to change our posture to one where all the policies that we had that were predicated on the two-state solution, we would re-examine all those. So we basically called for a thorough review of all U.S. policy towards Israel with respect to this issue. But at the same time, it felt very much to me like it was the end of the line for the president. He was basically like, look, we're done with this. We've tried. He was skeptical from the very beginning. They had put a lot of time and energy into this effort under Senator Mitchell and that team during his first term, and he was basically through with it. I was really concerned that we couldn't just walk away from this problem, that if we did, it was likely to get a whole lot worse. But I was having a very difficult time explaining that to White House staff and to other skeptical folks, including in my own building. Everybody other than Secretary Kerry, who continued to believe that we were inches away from peace right up until the very last day he was in office. And anyway, so I brought over a map to the state, to the White House, to try to illustrate to the crowd there what the situation was like on the ground, how quickly it was deteriorating, and why it was really important for us to continue to remain actively engaged in this issue, even as we changed our focus. I brought with me an 8.5 by 11 document that showed basically Israeli control over all of Area C. And we sort of passed it around the room, and I remember the president was squinting at it, and nobody could really read it. And everybody was like, well, this looks bad, Frank, but I can't really understand what I'm looking at. So on the way back, Kerry and I talked about turning that into a bigger presentation that just was include a bunch of maps to illustrate how the situation was going sideways on the ground. So we did wind up with about 15 maps that were giant maps. They were probably 4 feet by 3 feet, and we rolled them all up and we took them around the entire world. We showed them to the king in Saudi Arabia. I had to brief, I remember President Sisi and King Abdullah once, because Kerry was taking him through it, and so you got a call from Lavrov on Syria. So in any event, they're really quite funny documents now. They've got like coffee stains on them. I think Nasser Judah put his cigarette out on the bottom of one of them. They really turned out to be sort of the heart of our message on Middle East peace, which was, in effect, we have to keep on working on this, because if we look away from it, the two-state solution is going to end on the ground. And then once the administration was over, I gave those maps to the New Yorker, and I had a lunch with Jeremy Benamy one day, and he said, listen, I think it would be great if we could tell that same story, right, but just update it, and we can use it for all of J Street's presentations and then beyond. So I spent a bunch of time with folks at J Street just updating this. So some of the maps that you'll see here are the original maps that I used in the State Department, and some of them we have updated. We added a new section on the occupation, and obviously tried to keep it current with respect to what the Trump guys have been doing. So the what you're about to see here was really designed as much as possible to be objective and neutral on the issue. I was just trying to say, hey, these are the facts. Everybody who sees them needs to make up their own mind about what they mean and where we need to go from here. So I had them all vetted by CIA, all the facts and figures, mostly from the Israelis themselves, and nobody ever questioned the accuracy or validity of anything that was in here. So you can more or less rely on the veracity of what you're about to see. What conclusions you draw from that, I leave to you, although I'd be very, very happy to answer a bunch of questions once we get through this. So if that's okay, Abby, if you wouldn't mind, just pop them up on the screen and we'll get going.
Great, thank you, Frank. I'm just gonna get this presentation going, and I'm sure everyone in the audience will enjoy hearing your anecdotes as much as I do. So I hope that you share some of those as we go through the recording. Let me find that. All right, here we are.
So yes, please go back to everything. Great. Okay. Abby, if you can just go to the first slide here. I guess we'll just start by an overview. If there is one underlying message in all of this, it is that the Israelis are creating, in effect, a one-state reality on the ground that is inching ever closer towards being irreversible, as far as I'm concerned. And I think you've seen, when we get to the Trump administration's plan towards the end there, you'll see how that's manifesting on the ground these days. But that is the concern that I had. That is the concern I think that most people that follow this issue have. So that's a sort of the overarching narrative here is this irreversible one-state reality that's becoming more and more prevalent on the ground every day. So yeah, the one part of this that I think everybody has long since taken for granted is that two states for two peoples has always been the goal. That's always been the plan. That's the way Israel and the Palestinians have approached the problem in the 52 some odd years since the 67 war up until now, where and we'll get to this more at the end. I think that it's been a big effort to sort of change the narrative on all this. So this is one, just wanted to give people a sense of what the demographics really are like on the ground there. And I think that there's a nobody's questioning, and nobody should ever question the connection of the Jewish people to the state of Israel, right? It goes back thousands of years, and it's very, very important to respect and honor that. At the same time, it's also important to understand that there have been Arabs there for that whole time as well. And in fact, for the vast majority of this century, there have been more Arabs on the ground there than there have been Jews. And so when you're thinking about how do we ultimately fairly divide up this land, it's important to have an understanding of how both sides look at the problem. So you can see from 1882 till 1903, that's when we really saw the first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine. By 1918, the Jewish population was 60,000 folks. It was under 10%, whereas the Arab population was 500,000. So you had almost 10 times as many Arabs there as Jews right up until the end of the First World War. And then there was this great migration that happened after World War II for reasons that we all understand. And then the population became about even by 1948. So when the UN decided to create Palestine, which the United States obviously recognized, I think it was 7 minutes after that first became official, the plan all the way along was to create two states for two peoples, one Jewish state and one Arab state. And as you can see, the land allocation that came out of the partition plan was about 56% for Israel and about 44% for the Palestinians. That math doesn't quite work because Jerusalem was considered corpus separatum, so considered to be the province of neither side of it. But roughly the breakdown was about 55-45. And then obviously we all understand what happened in 48. There was all the Arab nations attacked Israel. They tried to annihilate Israel from the very outset. And that was I recommend everybody read a detailed accounting of that war, because it really was an extraordinary story of just how close Israel came to being annihilated from the very outset, and just what a sort of heroic struggle it was for them to survive. At the same time, there was a lot of what was effectively ethnic cleansing that was going on during that period, and we'll see that play itself out over the course of the next half century after that. But in any event, after the war ended, Israel controlled 78% of the land, right? And the Palestinians and really the Arabs controlled about 22% of it. And you can see they're shown in what's sort of a reddish color on my screen there. But so after 48 and with the 49 armistice, it was 78%. So it had gone from 56% for Israel to 78% for Israel. And then in 67, obviously, the Arabs all joined together and tried to wipe Israel off the face of the earth once more. And at that point, Israel wound up occupying, obviously, Sinai and the Golan Heights, and then, but also all of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so at that point, we were left with Israel proper was still only 78% of the land, but if you included the occupation, they basically exercised military control over the whole area. And what you've seen since then is that Israel has turned all of the West Bank that doesn't have Palestinian population centers in it, which I'll get to in a minute, is now effectively treated as part of Israel. So right now, the reality on the ground is that Israel controls 90% of the territory between the river and the sea. So they went from 56% in 47 to what's effectively 90% now. And the whole plan, again, in order to get back to peace, what was that Israel would withdraw from those areas that it occupied during the 67 war. This was UN Security Council Resolution 224 and 338, which called for the end of the occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, and for effectively that land to be returned to the Palestinians. And in return for that, there would be a lasting peace agreement. Obviously, that worked with the Egyptians in Sinai, and there have been obviously sort of fits and starts of that effort, some of which I was involved in. Secretary Kerry on Golan, I think that effort is probably over now forever. But in any event, the big piece of this, most important piece, this has always been negotiations surrounding the West Bank based on this premise of ending the occupation and exchanging land for peace. So what's happened since then? What we've seen here, the major agreement that's governed what goes on in the West Bank since 1993, well, really since 67, was the Oslo Accords. And I think it's important to understand what Oslo tried to do here was to create a Palestinian entity. It was actually, people that don't sometimes get this wrong, the Oslo Accords does not call for a creation of a Palestinian state. It called for creation of some kind of Palestinian entity, whether it be a state or something different. But the main point was Israel, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas. Area A, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner on my screen anyway, is about 18%. Area B is about 22%. And those were all the Palestinian population centers, right? So basically almost all the Palestinians lived in either Area A or Area B, and that's why it was divided up that way. And the Palestinians were given full civil and military control theoretically over Area A. Area B is split. Palestinians have full civil control, and that means things like they can build land, they can build on that land as much as they want, again, in theory. And then Area C was full Israeli civil and military control. But the main point to understand is that Area C was supposed to be transitioned over to the Palestinians, right, within 18 months. And there's a quote there from the Oslo Accords. The 2 sides agree that territory, except for issues that will be negotiated in the permanent status negotiations, will come under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority within 18 months. Right? So in effect, everything you see in turquoise on that map was supposed to become either Area A or Area B. So in other words, under a significant degree of Palestinian control, except for what you see in the red dots there. Those are settlements, and they were military zones, and they needed to be negotiated along with Jerusalem. But the basic premise was Area C is supposed to be transitioned from Israel to the Palestinians. Oh, Abby, I can't see this map on my screen. But in any event, I can just tell you guys what it shows is that instead of transitioning that land over in Area C over to the Palestinians, the Israelis have effectively transitioned it to settlers, right? And so Area C, which, as I said, is 60% of the West Bank, almost all of that falls within the jurisdiction of these regional settlement councils. So if you're a Palestinian and you live in Area C and you want to build anything at all, a lean-to, right, you've got to go effectively to either Kogat, which is the Israeli military authority, or in effect to the settler councils, right? And so you can imagine there's been basically no Palestinian building in Area C over the course of the last, 30 years or so, right? Just because in effect, the Israelis control of the decision-making on that. And as we'll get to in a little while, it's not just the absence of approvals to build for the Palestinians in Area C, they've been actively demolishing Palestinian structures in Area C. So as part of this process, there's been a massive growth in the number of settlers that are in the West Bank. So again, this is Area C, supposed to go over to the Palestinians. And in effect, it's been transitioned over to the settlers. And you can see that in the math. In 1993, there were 110,000 settlers living in the West Bank. So that's at the time of Oslo, and there's 110. And now there's close to 450,000 settlers in the West Bank. So that means in effect that there's 4 times as many settlers as there were at the beginning of this process. And the thing that's of particular concern to us was that almost 100,000 of them, I think it's over 100,000 now, of those settlers are east of the separation barrier. So if you look carefully at this map, and I don't know how well it's showing up on your screen, but the separation barrier is shown as a red line. And that was Israel's own separation barrier. So in other words, they effectively drew the border there, right, and put up a huge fence. Now this was in response to, in large part, Palestinian terrorist attacks, the Second Intifada, in particular. So there was a rationale. I won't get into whether I agreed with it or not, but the Israelis had was protecting themselves from these suicide attacks. But in any event, what they wound up doing was carving off about 10% of the West Bank, and about 80 to 90% of the settlers were west of the separation barrier. So the theory was always that, in effect, Israel would take everything that was west of that separation barrier, or significant parts of it, and then they would get 80 or 90% of the settlers, and the rest of the land in the West Bank would go over to the Palestinians. That was the basic approach of the Clinton negotiations, and without getting into too many details, more or less what we were contemplating during our negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So as a part of the process over the course of the last, I don't know, 30 years or so, the Israelis have really been growing, not just the amount of settlers, but obviously the number of settlements themselves. And just to be clear, and Trump administration and Netanyahu and his gang are playing games with this right now. So settlements are illegal under international law. This is not a disputed point among anybody who's actually looking at the facts. We had if you look at the Geneva Conventions there, it prohibits the transfer of civilian population of the occupying power into the occupied territory, regardless of whether forcible or voluntary, right? So it's pretty clear, right, that that's what has been going on here. And we had the lawyers at the State Department take a look at the issue anew, and they repeated to us that as far as international law was concerned, in their opinion, and in the opinion of everybody in the world other really than the Israelis, settlements are illegal, right? And so what we've seen then is, here, Abby, you can go to the next one. So what we've seen here, and I won't go through these in too much detail, I think that the point is clear, but we've just seen massive growth in the number of settlers that are living in the West Bank. And by the way, a lot of that occurred while it was Obama. So this process accelerated dramatically under Trump, but it was an ongoing process for, I would think, basically the last 50 years. Really, certainly since Oslo, it's been a steady buildup of Israeli settlers and settlements there. And you can see, if you look at these maps here, you can see Israel is not just building in what they call the blocks, or what we commonly thought of as the blocks right next to the border of Green Line Israel. They're building more and more and more settlements all throughout the West Bank. So from the very outset, you have to ask yourself, what was the intention here on Israel's side? At what point did they decide effectively that they just were going to make all of this into Israel by pouring more and more settlements in there? I think it's an interesting question to debate. My view would be that it's really from the very beginning that Netanyahu and his gang, starting with the election against Shimon Peres, and initially Rabin, and then he was assassinated, and then Peres, right after Oslo, they were very clear that their intention was to continue to build more and more settlements on this land, keep it all for Israel. And what you can see on the ground is that's more or less what's been happening. Under the Trump administration, it obviously just accelerated dramatically. So we used to fight the Israelis on these settlements all the time, and we agreed that they would do some building during the negotiations. That's what Netanyahu needed to do in order to get Naftali Bennett and that right-wing gang on board with the negotiations. But since the Trump administration has come in, it's really just been a free-for-all in terms of settlements. And you can see here, I won't go through all the statistics here, but just in the first 18 months since Trump took office, 15,000 settlement units were approved in the West Bank, which is more than 3 times the rate at which they were doing it at the end of the Obama administration, right? And you can see, you guys can see this presentation. I'm sure Abby can send it around later if you want to look more closely at the statistics, but it's really been a dramatic increase under Trump, 3 or 4 times as many settlements as there were previously. And this map here that you're looking at is just from about a year ago, but it shows new settlement units that were approved just in August of 2019. You can see where these things are located, right? They're putting them all throughout the West Bank here, way to the east of the separation barrier, again, suggesting an intent to keep all that land. So again, I think it's an important concept for people to understand that the settlements are not just random one-offs, although I'll get into illegal outposts a little bit later, and those can be sort of individual actions or actions of a small group of people. But the Israeli government itself has been systematically supporting the settlement movement for, as I said, really basically since Oslo, or I argue since the '67 war. But you can see, again, it's just ticked up, right? Israeli settlement spending jumped by 40% under Trump. That's $460 million a year, right? That Israel's spending on settlements in the West Bank. Which is, again, a 40% increase over what they were spending before when we were there. Because we would fight them on these things, and it was if nothing else, it was a pain in the neck for them. Now under the Trump administration, they're like, go. So that's what you're seeing on the ground here. It's really a systematic effort by the government of Israel to expand the settlement operation in the West Bank. And what's probably the part of it that really concerned me the most, and the part I really emphasized to the president and that gang was that, and all the folks in the White House, was people thought about settlements, right? And there's 100 or 125, give or take, settlements. But the thing that really got me the most concerned was what are called illegal outposts. And an illegal outpost is that can really just be, we call them wildcatters, but it's basically Jewish settlers who go out and they just put they create a brand new settlement of their own. And as you can see here, it starts with, yes, Abby, you can go to the next one. It starts looking like that right there. So it can just be a truck that you drive up, and it's a sort of like a camper. They have a few folks in there, and they'll be on that rooftop, and they say, okay, so this is our brand new settlement. Abby, you can go to the next one. And then after a while, some other families come and join, right? You can see now you'll have 3 or 4 of these trailers, and then maybe they build a little playground in the background. But again, to be clear, these are illegal under Israeli law, right? So these have not been permitted or approved by the Israeli government. And oftentimes they're put on private Palestinian land, right? So the IDF is out there effectively guarding these outposts as Israelis go and put them wherever they want to, effectively throughout the entire West Bank. What the Israeli government is supposed to do, so then you see that the third stage of these things, so we go from a few trailers, and then now the government starts hooking up electric lines. You can see some of the poles right there are power lines that are being put in, and then sewage lines get put in, and water lines get put in, and then we can go to the next one.
Frank, I just want to interrupt just for a little bit of clarity. Do you think, so you mentioned it a little bit more in the beginning, but for the people who are moving into these, according to Israeli law, illegal outposts, who governs them? Who cares for their well-being?
Well, the IDF guards them, right? Which is a big problem for the IDF. You have a lot more sort of areas to protect there, but basically they do whatever they want, right? That's and some of these guys are a problem for Netanyahu. I'm sure people have heard of the price tag group, but you have some fairly extreme right-wing settlers there who are, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but there's a fair amount of violence against Palestinians, and vice versa. There's a lot of friction that goes both ways around that. But yeah, these are effectively illegal, certainly unauthorized. I think all settlements are illegal. The outposts are unauthorized under Israeli law, so they're illegal under Israeli law as well as international. But anyways, so yeah, it gets to this point. Then you can see the next one. And they become little cities, right? And I went out and visited a bunch of them, but it's really extraordinary. They come from how quickly they can go from a couple of trailers into a brand new little town. They kind of look like gated communities in Phoenix or something, except for the golf courses. But anyways, the illegal outposts are really becoming a full-blown settlements, in a matter of a few years. And now what the Israeli government has started to do, so you had these settlements that were illegal, right, under Israeli law. But then what the Israeli government is now doing is retroactively legalizing those settlements, right? So the Israeli government will then go in and say, okay, well, that settlement's basically legalized now. And you see here, all these new settlements, these are just the new outposts that came up here. Look at where they're located, right? All throughout the West Bank, all throughout the prime Palestinian, the areas that really should be part of Palestine as contemplated by Oslo and beyond. But at any rate, just to give you a sense, these are where the illegal outposts are. And then the Israeli government has now effectively said they're all legalized, right? So you think of 125 settlements, they've actually built almost a similar number of illegal outposts. So think 250 settlements is what we're really talking about there, of varying sizes. And so this is, some of these new settlements, they're happening again 1 year ago. These new settlements new outposts are cropping up. And then they're getting legalized, and then they've all been incorporated into the Trump plan. And so if you look at where these, so the slide on my left here shows illegal outposts, and this was basically the number that were there when I was in the State Department. So you can see there's been a whole bunch more added since then. But look at how they compare with where the violent incidents are, right? And this is not necessarily Israelis versus Palestinians or Palestinians versus Israelis. This is just areas where there is violence between the two parties. And you can see they track almost exactly where the illegal outposts are. And this is the part of it that really got Obama's attention. If you look at this map here, the purple dots, which are really, they're probably just blurred into a bunch of purple areas on your map, but those are where there's existing demolition orders in Area C, right? And if you look at the green to the right, those are where demolitions have actually been carried out. But this has been a systematic effort that's really accelerated under Trump to basically clear all the Palestinians out of Area C, right? So if you're wondering, I once asked the Israeli Kogat, the guy who was in charge of the military occupation in the West Bank, whether there was a demolition order against every single Palestinian structure in Area C. And he goes, everyone? I don't know. But basically, yeah, they have the right to destroy any Palestinian structure, no matter how long it has been there, right? If it doesn't have an approval from the Israelis, which they will never give, right, then it's subject to demolition. So you have tens of thousands of Palestinians, including a bunch of Bedouins, who are living in Area C in homes that are subject to demolition orders, and you can have an Israeli bulldozer show up at your house at any point. And the other thing, and I'll start moving a little bit more quickly through these now, what the Israelis have been doing economically in the West Bank, they've basically been using it, treating it as part of Israel for economic purposes. So they take the quarries, there's industrial settlements that do a lot of manufacturing. All these hotels down by the Dead Sea are basically Israeli tourist sites. So again, in effect, Israel's treating all of Area C as if it was already part of Israel for economic purposes as well. So what you have at the end here is that the Oslo process has been reversed, right? So instead of transitioning Area C over to the Palestinians, as was contemplated by Oslo, they've transitioned it over to the settlers. And that's what we're looking at on the ground right now. So again, this is what the one-state reality, this is what you are really looking at on the ground right there. 90% Israeli, and those, you have basically the Palestinian archipelagos in the middle of Greater Israel. And if you're wondering whether I'm just kind of making this up or not, here's the map you get at Ben Gurion Airport, right? Anybody see Area C in there? Anybody see any Palestinian, any mention of the West Bank in there? This is the official Israeli tourism map. It's all Israel, right? It doesn't even show the Palestinian, Judea and Samaria. It shows there. That's, does it really hard to see where there's any Palestinians incorporated. So anytime you hear, I won't go into long talk about incitement, but anytime you hear talk about how Palestinian maps don't even show Israel on it, and it's not an example of horrible incitement, I always like to show them this, like, guys, this is what you get at the airport, right? So before you condemn the Palestinians for not recognizing Israel, just, I mean, what are we doing here, right, to the Palestinians? Anyway. So then I think people understand a lot of this stuff, so I'll move through these relatively quickly so we have enough time for questions, but just suffice to say, the Israeli military is a supreme authority, right, in the West Bank right now. Everything that happens there happens with the consent of the Israeli military, right? So it is occupied territory. It is occupied under the Geneva Conventions or the Hague Regulations. Whenever territory is placed under the authority of a hostile army, it is occupied territory, right? So there really, again, legally, there's just not a debate about whether there's an occupation that's going on in the West Bank right now. And by the way, I'll tell you, this isn't in the presentation, but when we were negotiating with the Israelis on a framework agreement, basically our version of the Trump's peace to prosperity plan, one of the things that the Israelis accepted without question was that there had been an occupation at least since 1967, and now suddenly that's getting called into question. But in any event, there is a military occupation there. It's not a hard question, not a close call under international law. So again, this is really an important one. Look at this map right here. You think of these, this is a blow up basically of areas A and B in the West Bank, right? There are 169 distinct Palestinian islands, right? So there is no contiguity among even the Palestinian areas in A and B. And there are dozens and dozens of checkpoints all around the West Bank. So if you want to go from one part of the Palestinian population center, so area A and B, to another, you have to get permission from the Israelis, and oftentimes, right? And then there's checkpoints all around that force you to endure huge delays. So just remember, you're talking about 169 rather individual entities separated from one another. And we'll get into the way that the Trump plan proposes to deal with all that. But there is no territorial contiguity for the Palestinians right now. And again, this is stuff you guys already know, but moving around in the simplest ways requires going through these checkpoints. It requires, dealing with the Israeli authorities. So, it's incredibly difficult just to lead a normal life going from, I want to go to the doctor's in the next Palestinian area. I can have to sit for hours on a line like that. And then again, there is effectively a segregated road system here, right? And Israelis and Palestinians, they take different roads. For that, there are some exceptions to that, but functionally, and the Israelis are pretty clever about making it technically possible for Palestinians to travel on some of those roads, but functionally speaking, there's two different sets of roads, one for the Israelis and one for the Palestinians in the West Bank. Again, the civil law Israeli civil law applies to the settlers, and Israeli military law applies to the Palestinians. So you have, in America, we used to call it separate. There was an argument under the Jim Crow era that you could be separate but equal. That's not true at all here, and it's not true at all there either. There's two very, very different sets of laws that apply, and two very different lives that you lead if you're a settler or a Palestinian in the West Bank. Again, this is especially true when it comes to any security-related issues. Again, Israelis can get all the protections of Israeli law, whereas Palestinians, it is really a tough thing if you're a Palestinian, you've been detained by the Israelis over there. They can hold you for 96 hours. They interview you in Hebrew, and they basically have preventive detention. They can keep you for as long as they want. And so you can see this has manifested itself in a lot more Palestinians and Israelis being, or large numbers of Palestinians being held in administrative detention in Israeli jails, including 800 to 1,000 Palestinians are detained by Israel every year, children. Okay. So then I just wanted to take this last section, talk a little bit about what the Trump administration and what the Israelis have been doing since Trump took office. So the main thing really is to redefine peace as the status quo. So as I said at the beginning, the plan was always Israel exchanges the occupied territories, right, for peace in a negotiation with the Palestinians. And what the Trump guys have been doing, and I think very cleverly with Netanyahu, is to just try to normalize the occupation and to redefine peace, not as 67 lines with, I would go back to with mutually agreed swaps, but rather as the status quo, right? So peace is no longer a negotiation based on 67 lines of mutually agreed swaps. Peace is now the status quo. And how they've done that is interesting if you follow it closely. They start referring to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, right? They start referring to Israeli settlements as Israeli communities. They no longer use the word occupied territory. They say it's disputed territory or jointly administered territory is ridiculous. And you see Friedman said, I don't believe the settlements have been illegal. Pompeo came out and said that that settlements are not illegal under international law. Although, by the way, he never made any kind of a case for why that was actually true as a legal matter. And as a lawyer, it was a sort of a glaring omission. He just said basically, like, we don't think these things are illegal anymore, without making any effort to explain how the rest of the world could possibly have been wrong about something so obvious as that. Okay, I'll do the next one. And then here, the other thing, and I think this is probably the most troubling part of it, has been Israel, the Trump administration's support for annexation, right? And again, it's the way it's worked without anything in return for the Palestinians. So I've heard even Ambassador Shapiro and others who supported Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and the recognition of that annexation by the Trump administration, even they would have said, Israel should have given something to the Palestinians in return for that. But they were never asked to do anything like that. Right? And again, annexation is illegal under international law. The occupant does not acquire sovereignty over the territory. It's as plain as day. Right? So these annexations, that's why you won't find anybody else in the world other than the Trump administration accepting these annexations. So so far it's been Jerusalem, we all know, and then they recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights as well. And now the big thing, of course, that we're all wrestling with is whether they're going to extend annexation to it's about 30% of the West Bank or half of Area C they would allow Israel to annex now. I think that's what Netanyahu and his gang are wrestling with right now. But it's important to note just how much of an aberration this is in terms of the way this conflict has been managed and the way the world views it. Netanyahu himself said it, if you look at the quote in the lower right-hand, we haven't had such an opportunity since the Six-Day War, and I doubt we'll have another opportunity for the next 50 years. So Trump has basically been giving Netanyahu and that gang the opportunity to do something that the whole world agrees is illegal and wrong and devastating to the two-state solution. So the question is whether they're going to have an opportunity to do that in the next 3 months, how they choose to handle it or not. But just understand, this is not the natural progression of things on the ground at all. This is the result of the Israelis systematically entrenching the occupation on the ground and waiting for a US government to come along that would accept that new reality that they're creating. So if you look at this Peace and Prosperity Plan, I think you guys have probably seen a lot of it. I just want to highlight a couple of things. This is the Trump administration's plan right here on the left, and you'll see it has the land swaps there in areas of the Negev that no one would ever go. I mean, I don't know what the hell the Palestinians are supposed to do with that land. It's like it's basically the desert, but at any rate, the thing I just want to highlight on this is that if you see this map, they show about 15 settlements, Israeli settlements, right, that are inside of the area. So what you see in turquoise here, that's the Palestinian territory. And you'll see there's some Israeli settlements in there. I think they list about 15 of them, right? But the reality is that's a tiny fraction of the number of settlements that are actually within those areas that would theoretically be new Palestine. Just look here on the right. This shows sort of a more comprehensive picture of the number of settlements there are. But you can superimpose those two. There's probably 5 or 6 times as many settlements and illegal outposts inside that Palestinian territory as the Trump map suggests. So just ask yourself, how are you supposed to have a Palestinian state, which is 169 little blocks of land with settlements interspersed in between them, right? The way they do that is something called transportational contiguity, but it's basically a series of roads that connects all these settlements back up to Israel and then the Palestinian areas themselves. But this is nothing remotely approaching a territorial contiguity or anything anybody would accept as a state. Well, and why is that? Because the Trump administration basically negotiated it with Netanyahu, and you can see they're all kind of sitting around smiling at what a great plan they came up with. It's really easy to negotiate something when you're negotiating it with yourself, right? We had the additional burden of actually trying to incorporate what the Palestinians cared about. Into that, Obama said, we're not putting out an American plan unless it's sort of balanced and reflects the needs of both sides, something the whole international community can get behind. And these guys kind of took the opposite approach. In some ways, as a former negotiator, I envy them. It must have been a lot of fun to sit around and for Friedman and Kushner and Greenblatt to negotiate with each other, with I'm sure Bibi's helpful input, just how badly they could sort of screw the Palestinian. Anyway, I digress. The main thing to understand is, again, no Palestinian input into this whatsoever. And putting aside all the nuances of this one, you guys can go read the thing. I won't go through all the details of it, but the main thing to understand is that the Palestinians get nothing out of this until, and I'm not making this up, until they become Canada. And this is what Friedman said. You don't have to live with that Palestinian state. You have to live with the Palestinian state when the Palestinians become Canadians. If Palestinians become Canadians, all your issues would go away, right? There is a quote in there, the Palestinians can only get anything, right? So they get nothing at all, not one single thing, unless and until they disarm Hamas in Gaza. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, Israel can't disarm Hamas in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority, they're not even allowed to have really any weapons. Like, how are they supposed to go disarm Gaza? So anyways, there's a number of tripwires in here that basically make it clear that no matter what this thing says, it does not actually contemplate giving anything to the Palestinians unless a series of conditions that are impossible to meet have been met by the Palestinians. And Bibi, actually, ironically enough, got in trouble with the settlers for this thing because the settlers don't even want to give any of that land to the Palestinians. So he's had to go and do some damage control with the Palestinian, with the settlers rather. And if you can see what he says is, Bibi says this flat out, the annexation plan will not include the establishment of a Palestinian state. The government will definitely not approve it. So whenever it was said in the Trump plan of a two-state solution, you have Friedman acknowledging the insurmountable hurdles that would have to be surmounted before you could have anything approaching Palestinian autonomy. And now Bibi saying, like, even that's never going to happen. So anybody who tells you that this was just imagine if the Palestinians had come up with a peace plan with the Arab League, and then went and announced it and said, okay, this is our plan, and it had the Palestinians getting every single thing they wanted, the Israelis getting nothing. and then saying to the Israelis, hey, come negotiate with us on this basis, or you're the one who doesn't believe in peace. It's a crazy way to look at it, and that's why that has not gained any traction. So as the Israelis are contemplating annexation, which is, so again, the Palestinians get nothing until a series of impossible conditions have been met. The Israelis are allowed to annex right now, right, under the plan. That's the fundamental absurdity of the whole thing. It's not what it says, it's what it does, right? And so what you've had is the whole world standing up and saying, wait a second, if you annex the West Bank right now, or the 30% of it that they're contemplating annexing, you're basically saying the two-state solution no longer exists, right? And as we can see, there's been widespread condemnation of that. Biden has said, in effect, that he might reverse any recognition of that annexation. He hasn't been explicit about it, but that between the lines, you could read that into it. He certainly does say, I will reverse Trump's undercutting of peace. Yeah, Boris Johnson, again, strong supporter of Israel. And then Yusuf al-Taiba, who came to the White House to listen to to be present for the unveiling of the Peace to Prosperity plan, put a really incredibly historically significant op-ed and I think it was in Haaretz, but it was in Hebrew, and it basically said this process of normalization that has been so important to Israel over the years with the Gulf Arabs will come to a crashing halt, right? If annexation moves forward. So the Emiratis, what you understand, are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the Gulf Arabs wanting to normalize relations with Israel. And they have a lot of reasons to want to do that, many of them involving Iran, but they've all put their foot down and said annexation will be the end of that process. Interestingly, and I'll just talk for 1 second about this. Otaiba does not say that all these elements of normalization are contingent upon peace with the Palestinians, right? He says they're only contingent on not annexing, right? So the bar has really been lowered for Israel to move forward, certainly with the Emiratis, and I think others would follow after that. All they got to do is refrain from annexation. So I think that's part of the reason why the Israelis are struggling with this a little bit right now. So the other thing, and I'll move through this last part quickly, the Trump administration basically cut off the Palestinians entirely. They cut off UNRWA, they closed the PLO delegation in the United States, they've cut off all money, all USAID money that went to the Palestinians, and effectively tried to bully them into agreeing to negotiating on the basis of the Trump administration plan for Palestinians. It's a fundamental misreading of the Palestinians. They look, they're very difficult to deal with, and a lot of, I think they've made a lot of mistakes along the way, no question, but one thing I will say, that they have pride, and there's just no way they're going to accept getting bullied by the Trump administration into negotiating on the basis of a plan they rigged up with the Israelis. So all of these closures have resulted in the Palestinian Authority, cutting off of all this, the Palestinian Authority is really in big trouble right now. And you see that what they've said basically is if the Israelis continue down the path they're continuing down, certainly if they annex, what the Palestinian Authority is going to do is just disband, right? And so put the Israelis in charge of all of the West Bank. Now you can understand, Palestinians get billions of dollars a year in their own clearance revenues and in support from Arabs, from the United States and from others. If that money goes away, who's going to foot the bill for the whole occupation now, right? It's going to have to be the Israelis. The Palestinians, their ultimate card to play is to collapse and say, hey, this whole thing is your problem, right? And so the Israelis, well, on the one hand, they're saying, we got to cut off Palestinian funding because they're using it to pay for, to support terrorists. The reality is the Israeli government is now channeling hundreds of millions of shekels under the table to the Palestinians because, well, on the one hand, they're saying, oh, these terrible people, they're all support for terrorists, we can't do any business. On the other hand, they realize that they need the Palestinian Authority effectively to survive. Otherwise, they're going to inherit a gigantic mess here, right? And that's what we're starting to see more and more Palestinians talk about. In fact, with COVID has put a whole lot of pressure on the Palestinian Authority to begin with, and you couple that with their unwillingness to take Israeli tax revenue, their own tax revenues from the Israelis, and they cut off a lot of international assistance. And the Palestinian Authority is hanging on by a thread right now. They have not been salaries for the last 2 months. I think even the security forces are getting paid half of what they're supposed to now. So you're getting to the point where the Palestinian Authority is teetering on the edge. My view is that they won't intentionally collapse because too many of them, the people that would be making that decision, have their livelihoods involved, but you could see a slow motion disintegration of the Palestinian Authority. And people that really track this issue closely, that's the thing they're most concerned about with annexation. It's not only the death of the two-state solution, but really the death of the status quo. So ironically, while the whole plan of the Israelis and the Trump administration has been to call the status quo peace, by doing that so overtly, they may have made it impossible to sustain the status quo in any form. And so what are you left with? Again, this is everybody's pretty well aware of this one, but the majority between the river and the sea is no longer Jews. It's now Palestinians, Arabs, Christians, and otherwise. And so what are you left with? And I'll just leave you guys for Lindsey Graham, by the way, is one of the strongest supporters of Israel in all of Congress and one of Trump's closest foreign policy advisors. I will not invest a dime in a situation that results in one state's bad for America, right? You can see he's basically saying this is apartheid in between the lines. He calls it South Africa at the end. And so I think that there are some people who are outside of the pure politics of this who are starting to say, hang on a second, where is all this headed? But in any event, I'll stop there. I've gone way over my time, but happy to stick around a little longer at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Abby for any questions.
Thank you so much, Frank. Bear with me, everyone, while I remove this presentation, and we're going to start with some questions. All right. Okay, so regarding, I think we're just going to go to there were a few questions raised about settlements in particular. So we're going to first go with who is paying for the development of the illegal settlements? Frank? Did you catch that?
Sorry, Abby, I didn't hear that. Can you say it one more time?
You know what I think I might even do is, okay, so we have a couple of questions pertaining to the settlements in particular. The first of which is, who is paying for the development of the illegal settlements?
The Israeli government.
Great.
Right. I think in the first instance, the guys that drive the trailers out themselves are they're probably footing that bill for the initial sort of setup of the illegal outpost, but relatively quickly thereafter, the Israeli government steps in. As I said, they do the power lines, the water lines, and all the rest of it. And that's where that bar graph you saw, the hundreds of millions of dollars the Israelis have put into the settlement enterprise the Israeli government has. So this is official state policy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We also have another question pertaining more specifically to interpretations of international law. Let's see if I can decipher this. How do you square your interpretation of international law with regard to the settlements with the Israeli claim that they are not illegal?
Well, the Israeli claim that they're not illegal is based on the notion that they aren't actually occupying the territory of another state, because the West Bank was controlled by Jordan and it was never really part of Jordan either. But so all I can say is that around the world, among international lawyers, among governments all around the world, I am not aware of any other government in the world that takes the Israeli position with respect to the legality of settlements, other than Pompeo, who just came out and said it, but it was really a policy decision, not a legal decision there. So I mean, I could take you guys through the nuances of it. I think the Geneva Convention is pretty straightforward in terms of how it describes it. And I spent a lot of time with the lawyers at the State Department, and they said this is not a close call. There's really no strong argument on the other side. But in any event, everybody has their own version of reality. All I can say is that it is the overwhelming consensus of the international community and of international lawyers that settlements are illegal in international law.
Thanks, Frank. We have many, many very interesting and good questions. I'm trying to get through a few of them here. I think this section will be good for you. I'm going to kind of focus it around about questions pertaining to the Palestinians. So the first is, I have always been in favor of a two-state solution, but it seems to me that the Palestinians would not accept that and appeared to want everything from the river to the sea. If that is true, then what should Israel do? Loaded question there for you, Frank.
Yeah, sure. Well, listen, it's great to have every different perspective to parse through here. But I can tell you, having directly negotiated with the Palestinians on this for months and months, but also just what they say publicly, they're not looking for all of the land by any stretch of the imagination. Their position is they want the West Bank to be returned to the Palestinians as it was supposed to be under 242 and 338 and under the Oslo Accords, based on a negotiation on the 1967 lines of mutually agreed swaps. Right, so I can tell you the Palestinians could probably have lived with 90% of the West Bank, 90 to 95%. And again, I'm not saying that's a reasonable position for them to take now, but there's never been a scenario in which they're asking for all of the land from the river to the sea. That's just that's not remotely accurate. And just look at what they say publicly. We want the 67. We want return of the West Bank to the 67 lines, mutually agreed swaps, and East Jerusalem as our capital. That's their public position on it. So no one on the Palestinian side is talking about all the land from the river to the sea. That's not where they're at.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm actually going to move along to a security-oriented question. In your opinion, and obviously you've experienced reality on the ground in both the West Bank and Israel proper, is it possible to end the occupation without compromising Israel's security?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it's a really tough question. And honestly, that was right at the heart of what we spent the most time working on. We brought in a guy named General Allen, who ran a whole process involving many different departments at DOD and otherwise, and done it in conjunction with the IDF. So he had a lot of relations. I think Gantz was one of his counterparts at the time, and they went through all the different. Israel had 29 different security-related questions and concerns that they had, and so Allen, who was one of our top generals, and Gantz, who was Israel's top general, went through them one by one. And what Gantz told us, what Allen told us, was that if you left that question to be resolved between professional military guys, between the Israelis and the Palestinian militaries, the Israeli and the U.S. militaries, that there would have been a way to address Israel's security concerns while still giving the Palestinians a legitimate state. And that involved, I can take you guys through a lot of the different nuances of all of that, but in effect, what we were trying to do was remove indicia of occupation. So what we were trying to get was not so many Israeli soldiers, walking around in the West Bank, making the Palestinian people feel like they were occupied. So we were transitioning to a very heavy Mossad presence there of plainclothes Israeli security guys working in conjunction with the Palestinian Authority security forces, which is largely what they're doing right now. So we're trying to keep a lot of the security elements in place, just make them less obtrusive to the Palestinians. And then on the border, there was going to be massive presence of, we called it the safest, that border is only 90 kilometers long. We called it the safest 60 miles in the whole world, in the sense that we were going to put, Allen had a whole plan. We were going to put billions of dollars into security mechanisms to basically make that border impermeable. And I remember and I think this is in Carrie's book, but the time when I knew these negotiations were not going to work was in early 2014. We went over and briefed Netanyahu and Bogi Ya'alon, who was the defense minister at that time. Allen and I did. Kerry was there too, but then he had to go to another meeting. So this wound up with me and Allen and Ya'alon and Netanyahu, and Allen basically said, look, I've talked about this with your guys. We're going to have a phased Israeli withdrawal as the Palestinians meet certain conditions, but Israel will retain a much lower key presence and the right to go back in if any of this stuff starts to go sideways. So remember, you have Mali Adumim, we're going to station a big IDF presence, and then one at the top of the West Bank and one at the bottom of it. So again, you could have the Israelis back in, occupying the place entirely within 7 or 8 minutes, right? Or responding to an individual terrorist action or the penetration of the border within 6 or 7 minutes, and basically a full reoccupation within 24 to 48 hours. So the premise was, look, make the Palestinians prove that they can keep this place safe. You'll have an understated or more low-key presence, and if that all goes sideways, you go right back in. And so as Allen said, the IDF thought they could make that work. And at first, Bibi said, "Hey, listen, I think this could work." And then the next morning, we went to breakfast with them, and Bibi said, "We're not doing this. We're never giving up the Jordan Valley." Right. And so at that point, it became clear that it wasn't questions about security so much as it was questions about what Israel wanted to keep and what Israel didn't want to keep. Right. So again, there's a lot of really, really hard questions to be answered in there. And you can go back. Ilan Goldenberg at CNAS did a whole presentation on the security mechanisms that we were contemplating at the time. Ilan was my chief staff during that year. And so you can read a lot about what Allen had proposed and make up your own mind about whether you think it's going to work or not. All I can tell you is that as between the Israeli military and the U.S. military, there was a sense that these were mostly solvable problems as part of a long-term transition with their what we call their Israelis' right of return, which was to say the military could go back in if anything ever went sideways. And I think ultimately our view is it was a political decision not to pursue those kind of solutions anymore to a point. But yeah, I don't want to underestimate just how difficult the security piece of it is, and what I think it was the most difficult part of those negotiations along with Jerusalem.
Thank you, Frank. So we are winding down to our end of session, but there are just so many amazing questions coming through. So I just want to pose one more question.
Yeah, I can stick around, Abby. I don't know whether how you guys are on time.
We can.
I can stay around as long as you want, if that's helpful, or whatever works for you.
I think what we'll do, we'll just take two more final questions. So I'm going to sort of mix up a few that have a similar theme, and then for whoever wants to stick around, you'll move into the discussion session, and we can kind of dig into some of the questions that were asked. So Frank, one of the questions that's been asked: how important do you think it is for the Democratic platform specifically to mention and condemn the occupation?
Oh God, that's a great question. You know, I'll speak candidly. I'm of mixed minds about it. As a policy matter, it is I don't think it's a real question legally as to whether there is an occupation or not. And I think I'm very sensitive to the Israeli and Trump administration's efforts to redefine, as I said, a piece as the status quo, and a big part of that is pretending there's not an occupation. So they're basically normalizing the status quo and telling the Palestinians it's the best they're ever going to do. So as a policy matter, I think it's crazy not to mention the occupation, right? It's allowing this messaging campaign to subtly redefine the whole paradigm and the whole dynamic on the ground. At the same time, I've worked on those. I started on the Kerry campaign in 2003, and then I obviously was involved in the discussions around the platform in 2012 it would have been. And I understand the politics of this, and I'm not sure I would have thought it was so important as a policy matter to fall on to pay a big political price for that. But yeah, I think it's up to people individually to make their own mind up about whether that's a worthwhile statement to make politically. All I will say is that as a matter of the reality on the ground, it's not a difficult question.
Thank you, Frank. So I think we're just gonna kind of wrap it up with one final question, which is sort of, taking a little bit from the last question, but from your experience on the ground and just all of the work that you've done, both, in Washington and actually in Israel-Palestine, what do you think is the path forward?
Well, we did something called the Quartet Report, which set forth a series of steps that each side could take on the ground to begin a process of separation. I personally, again, I'm probably not on the same song sheet as Abby and my esteemed friends and colleagues at J Street on this, but I don't believe personally that a negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians could ever be successful right now. I think we're a really long way away from that. What I think needs to happen is the process of separating Israelis from Palestinians on the ground right now, and beginning to create a two-state reality on the ground as opposed to entrenching a one-state reality. And the Quartet Report laid out a series of steps that each side could take to begin that process of separation and start to create an atmosphere where people believe that peace was possible. And then maybe you could get to a point where there was going to be a real two-state solution. But I think it's much more likely that you'll see, if this process of separation begins, that you'll see something that looks like Gaza, where you'll have a unilateral Israeli withdrawal to some defensible positions there, and then just let everybody who wants to stick around on the other side of it stay around the other side of it. But the other alternative, and I think probably so that's the best case scenario, I think, is a step-by-step process of separation, and then holding out the possibility that might allow for a two-state negotiation in the future. There's also a group called Commanders for Israel Security, which I think has done some really, really good work on this. People are interested in doing some more reading on it. Look up the plan from Commanders for Israel Security, which is a bunch of former very senior IDF officials came up with basically what's a separation plan on the ground that doesn't involve anything from the Palestinians. I think much more likely the Palestinian Authority is just going to disintegrate over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, and you're going to have it's all going to be Israel, and it's going to be segregated realities on the ground there, and it's just going to be a thorn in the side of Israel as far as the eye can see. So I'm afraid that's where this is headed, absent some kind of dramatic change. And again, it's not just the U.S. administration's position. The Trump guys have fanned those flames, right? But at the end of the day, there's very little that anybody can do to stop this process on the ground right now. So yeah, I'm not optimistic about where all this is headed. And then the last thing I'll say is I think you got a lot of Palestinians now who are saying, okay, we all live in Israel, but give us our rights. And again, that's that's an interesting concept. Theoretically, hey, it's one state. Israelis are never going to do that. That really is a disintegration of the Jewish state. I don't think anybody's in favor of that now. So not a lot of good answers on the ground here right now. But I do think it's important to start taking steps physically on the ground that are going to head in the opposite direction from the one we're in right now. And if Biden wins and they call me back to say, okay, what do you do? I'm going to say, listen, let's just go back to the Quartet report, Commanders for Visual Security, start creating two states on the ground right now, and then hope that creates more possibilities down the road. That's not especially inspiring, I realize. So I will leave it to you guys. I think we need a new generation, as I was saying to Abby before, we need a new generation of thinking on this issue. I think she and I did a little bit of work on updating this presentation, and my message to her was, hey, you better figure this out because it's on you guys to figure out where we go from here. So with that inspiring note and having shoved responsibility for this mess onto everybody else's shoulders, I'll say thank you very much for having me, and happy to follow up anytime or answer any questions you guys might have down the road.
Thank you so much, Frank. And it's really been an honor to have you explain everything to us. And I think it just goes without saying that it's really, really critical to have just a broad knowledge base and understanding of the facts on the ground. And I think that for those who are just being exposed to this for the first time, this is just the beginning of your educational process. So we hope that you join us in more J-School sessions. And Frank, again, thank you so much for joining us. And to those of you who are going to be staying for the discussion portion of this session, please tune in and join the follow-up Zoom link, and see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you, everyone.
All right, good luck, guys. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.